Hey there. Welcome back to Shavings and Cravings. We're going to continue working on this hickory slab mantle project. Next step is to fill these knot holes and any small cracks with some epoxy. For that I'm going to be using this West Systems 105 and 206 resin and hardener and their pump set, which should make it really easy to mix up. Before we can mix that up though, we need to tape off these holes, and there's a chunk in the back of one as well. So I'm going to be using a combination of painter's tape and aluminum tape, and we will mix some epoxy up and pour it in layers. So let's get at it. So we're going to start on each of these knots by covering it up with some blue painter's tape. This will act as the bottom, so the epoxy will rest against it and hopefully give us a fairly flat surface, after which we'll go through and sand it down to make it flat with the surface of the wood. Make sure that's nice and tight against it. We don't want it coming apart and all of our epoxy dumping out. Some of these holes are going to be on the bottom, and I'm not sure if there's actually a hole on the other side right there, but we're going to go ahead and tape it up anyways and pour any from the top, and then we'll flip it over, and any of the ones that will be exposed from the underside we'll make sure are filled all the way as well. Continue on this process, and we'll move the aluminum tape once we flip it on its back. Alright, next we're going to flip this back onto its bottom here, and we'll work on getting the holes, like right here. This knot falls against the back edge, so we can't just tape the bottom there, because otherwise the epoxy will just run out. So I'm going to run a strip of aluminum tape, which has a little bit more backbone, across right here, and give it something to pour against. This is my first time doing this kind of epoxy pour, so kind of hoping this works out. Watched a few videos on it, and this is what they recommend doing. We'll see how it goes. Now this one right here, we've taped off from the bottom. It appears that knot I need to pour from right here, but you can see it also has a void on the side. So we're going to go ahead and put some more aluminum tape right here as well. So that way when we pour this in, it's not going to just pour out the back here. And this one I'm going to go ahead and wrap underneath, just to give that painter's tape a little bit of structure to hold up. Alright, ready to mix up my epoxy. Got the resin and the hardener here. The way this pump system works is one pump to this to one pump of this gives you the exact ratio that you need for the correct hardening. I've also got a couple dyes here, black and brown, so I'm going to add probably a few drops of each just to kind of give it a darkish hue in those knots. And I think I'm going to do about 4 pumps of each. Should give us a good chunk of epoxy that we can use to pour. So let's see how it goes. 1, 2, 3, 4. We'll do 5. And 5 of these. And I'm going to go ahead and add a few drops of this before I mix it. And a couple of those. mix this really well. You can already see that turned it nice and dark. So that should work out good. We're going to mix this really well and then we're going to pour. Start with this big boy back here. Start pouring it in. We're probably only going to do about a half an inch or so at a time to avoid it from flashing over, getting too hot. Some of these aren't nearly as large, so they won't take as much. That one's not very big at all, but that might soak in here in a minute. So I'll take some of that and spread it into this little crack here. This epoxy has, I believe, about a 30-minute working time. So you should have plenty of time to start pouring and getting it ready. Some of these I'm going to go almost to the top because they're not just a big set of epoxy. That one's draining pretty good somewhere though. Alright, I'm going to mix up another set and we will continue on. I got another set of epoxy going. We'll pour these bigger holes in here and then we'll let it sit for a second. I'll probably take the blowtorch over a few of them to pop a few bubbles, but because I want to pour another layer on top, it won't be as imperative to get all the bubbles out. Stuff pours pretty nice into those cracks. Flows pretty well. With that pour, I think we will let that cure for a while. Actually, like I said, so you can see here, maybe you can see, maybe you can't. There's a few little surface bubbles, so I'm just going to just run the blowtorch over it really quick. A couple hours have passed, and I fear that I've had a lack of containment. It appears that the tape up here, the epoxy seeped through and deposited down the floor. Don't mind the cat. She's just checking out what's going on. Glad she didn't step in the pool of epoxy. The rest of it appears to have cured well. It's nice and hard, a little bit below the surface, so I'm going to go ahead and pour up a few more cups of epoxy here and we'll fill up the rest of these holes and let it cure, and we'll flip it over and get it on the bottom side. So we're going to sit here and mix this up. Once they're all mixed up, we'll go ahead and pour it in. Nope, nope, nope. Well, now you're trying to help too much. come back with the torch and get off some of these bubbles with just a light touch of the flame. So today's tomorrow again, and I've gone ahead and flipped the slab back over, and what I'm going to do is take off this painter's tape, see what the epoxy looks like on the bottom. Then I'm going to mix up a couple little batches of it and fill in some of these smaller cracks that are on the bottom, like right here, and a couple little divots. On the other side, I did notice there's a couple little spots that I'm going to need to fill back in tomorrow once I flip it over again. But for now, let's start with this. We'll start by taking this painter's tape off. And what I'm looking for is just to make sure that the knot hole fill all the way in. Appears to have, there's a little bit right here that'll fill in from this side, but pretty close to being smooth across right there. That side will have to fill in from this side. Yeah, little hole right there will have to fill from this side too. Yeah, aluminum tape worked pretty good. Kept it in there. Yeah, so with that, I'm going to set back up and pour some more. Set up another batch, probably way too much for this pour, but mixed up another batch of epoxy. I'm going to pour it into these voids and these little cracks on the bottom here. Did about 6 squirts. Probably should have done about 4. Maybe it'll soak up more than I think. So far this stuff's been pretty easy to work with. I've been liking it. It seems to pour pretty easy, mix pretty easy. We'll see how it goes once I need to actually sand it, but for right now, it's doing what it needs to do. Matt from the future here. As you can see, I'm pouring the epoxy down the tiny cracks that form all the way down the slab in order to stabilize the slab and also to give it a nice look. One thing I'd suggest if you're doing this is instead of just pouring it onto the slab like I'm doing, place some blue painter's tape on either side of the cracks or any of the large voids that you're going to be filling like that, so that you can reduce the amount of epoxy that gets on the wood, which then will reduce the amount of sanding and scraping that you need to do. Because as I found out after this, it's kind of a pain to get this epoxy off the top. So yeah, little hint there. In the subsequent fillings that I did for other cracks that popped up, I did do the painter's tape, and it did save a lot of time with the sanding after that. I'm going to go ahead and speed this part up. It's just me filling the cracks all the way down. I did repeat this process multiple times over the course of doing the epoxy, because each time I would sand it, I would find another crack that I missed, or little bubbles that had popped up that I didn't quite fill. So this was a multi-part process of pouring epoxy, sanding, pouring a little bit more epoxy. After all that epoxying, I think it's time for a drink. Tonight we're going to do a Caipirinha, which is the Brazilian national drink. It's made with cachaça, which is like a rum, but it's made with sugarcane juice as opposed to molasses. Very similar though. The other ingredients is going to be a little bit of sugar, super fine if you have it. I just used a coffee grinder to make it a little bit finer. and half a lime cut into 4 wedges. So to go ahead with this, we're going to put our sugar in there. It says a half to about 2 teaspoons. So I'm going to do a little less than 2 teaspoons of the sugar. And then you're going to drop your limes in there, and you're going to muddle it with a muddler. Get that all mixed up. Add your ice. And then it's about 2 ounces of the cachaça. And this is an aged cachaça. You can also get clear, which is the just unaged, but this stuff tastes a little bit smoother. Pretty nice. A finger stir as usual. And then cheers.